All right. Good evening, folks, and welcome to Wild Things Wednesday. And as many of you probably read in the description of this, we have been doing some Wild Things Wednesdays. We started in January, and we'll do one every Wednesday from now until the end of March. And we've been having a lot of great conversations and talks from the Wild Things 2025. And there's just so many presentations that, of course, you can't see them all. So we've had a series going on Wednesdays. The meeting is being recorded. We will share out the link. And so anybody who registered will get the link. And so with that, so as to not waste any more time with me talking, I'm going to turn it over to Kim Erndt-Pitcher from Prairie Rivers Network, and she is going to introduce herself and begin our program for this evening.
Hi, everyone. As Amy said, I'm Kim Erndt-Pitcher with Prairie Rivers Network. I'm the Director of Ecological Health. Amy, can you see my screen,
Yes.
the slides? Great.
Yes.
Okay. So today's talk, Marty Kemper, my collaborator in this work for our monitoring at Prairie Rivers Network, are going to present sort of the background on the issue of drift, as well as talk about the monitoring that Prairie Rivers Network has done. And then David Zayas from the Illinois Natural History Survey could not be present with us tonight, but I'm going to present some of his data of the slides and bits and pieces we feel most comfortable talking about. And then I'll jump back in and kind of wrap up of what we're doing to work on this issue from a larger perspective at Prairie Rivers Network. So I'm going to go ahead and start us off. And many of you know that, we use pesticides for lots of different reasons. We use them to control broadleaf weeds and turf, unwanted weeds and shrubby material in rights of way. We use them to grow our crops, and we use them to maintain, the quality of our natural areas that we all love. But, one of the leading uses of pesticide in the United States is agricultural production. We use a lot for turf management and weed control in lawns, but by far, per acre, the leading use is agricultural production. And that's because 75% of our land isn't in production. And the majority of those acres are planted with crops that are tolerant to herbicides, such as soybeans and corn. And when I say tolerant, that means, historically we would use herbicides to kill the weeds prior to planting. Then we would plant our crops, and then we'd use a variety of weed control methods to control those weeds, such as light tillage, et cetera. In the 1990s, we started getting traits and seeds that were resistant to herbicides. So you could plant that seed in the ground. You'd spray your herbicides, then plant that seed in the ground. It would grow, and then as the plant continued to grow, you could spray herbicides over the top of that growing plant, kill the weeds, and the plant would still thrive. And now we have many, many crops out there that are tolerant to a variety of herbicides, many times more than one herbicide. And this has really led to a very heavy reliance on the use of herbicides as the primary source of weed control in our agricultural systems. And in addition to that, many of you know just from driving around, we also have fewer fence rows. People are tearing down these fence rows. We have bigger farm equipment. Our fields are bigger. And, when we used to have these very, diverse cropping systems, maybe we had pasture one year, or it was fallow, we had livestock integrated into the farming system, we had wheat, we had maybe pumpkins or corn, and then beans. We had multiple crops, and all of those things help break up the pest cycle, whether it's weed pest or insect pest. And when you lose that diversity, you lose that resilience in those systems. And that, in combination with the increased use in pesticides, has really changed our landscape. And these are graphs of 5 widely used herbicides in the United States for agricultural production, specifically ones that are commonly used in Illinois. We have dicamba, we have 2,4-D, we have glyphosate, we have glufosinate. All of these 4 herbicides are trending up over the years. These graphs stop with their data at 2019. We're waiting on the next 5-year set. We hope to get that information in the next few months. Keep our fingers crossed. Atrazine is a widely used herbicide. It always has been. It is predominantly used in corn. It's also used a little bit in some turf management. Atrazine is one of those pesticides that we find in our drinking water resources quite frequently. So, I was talking about how we started to use these pesticides in the 1990s when we started using these seeds that were developing resistance to herbicides. And you can see this graph here. When we started doing that, the weeds also started developing resistance to herbicides. And this graph right here is just showing the different types of weeds that have developed resistance over the years by class of herbicide. And along with these changes in agriculture, we have also seen the symptoms of herbicide injury throughout the landscape, whether it's in wild plants like this white oak here or in cultivated plants like this peach. This peach, I took this photo in 2020 at the orchard right down the road from me. I'm in Jackson County, right on the Jackson County Union line. And, this orchard has had to take down thousands of trees. And this was right around the time that dicamba-resistant soybeans came out and were really widely being used in the state. 2017, 18, and 19, we started seeing a lot of injury. 2019 and 2020, it just continued. So we might start to see some more dicamba this year because it will be back on the landscape. But in response to people calling Prairie Rivers Network and talking with people like Marty, who's a member of PRN, and mentioning the fact that they have these trees that look unhealthy, the leaves are curled and cupped, we started our tree and plant health monitoring program. And Marty's really been a huge driver in this work. So have other members and partners of ours, Lou Nelms and the Swobodas, and people have just really rallied around helping us develop this monitoring program and identifying the prevalence and the severity of these symptoms across the state, as well as the distribution of these symptoms. And Marty's going to talk to you a little bit about what those symptoms look like, how we monitor and how we document. But I'm going to talk a little bit real quick here about the issues of drift themselves. And, when we talk about drift and how pesticides move through the atmosphere, there's 2 main ways. Primary drift, which is like particle drift, which happens at the time of application, be it a backpack sprayer that's applying it through the lawns, an airplane, or a boom sprayer. Those particles that are in the air are being blown or carried away by the winds off their target site. And that's called primary or particle drift. We also have vapor drift. And vapor drift is a little bit different. It really has to do with the vapor pressure of that chemical itself. And you can apply it according to label. It's not a windy day, perfect conditions. 1 day, 5 days, 6 days later, you get the right temperatures and humidity, and those chemicals can evaporate or essentially volatilize, move long distances in the atmosphere, and fall out in areas where they can cause injury. And this is, a really good illustration of what happened when dicamba-tolerant soybeans and cotton came out in the landscape. Throughout the Midwest and the Southeast, we saw widespread injury at a landscape scale because of the volatilization from people applying it to tens of millions of acres. So the next several minutes, you're going to see from Marty lots of different photos and pictures of trees and plants that we've monitored over the years. It's important to remember that these injuries are not happening, alone out there in the environment. They're happening in an environment that is also experiencing habitat loss, under pressures of invasive species, other diseases and pathogens, as well as fire suppression and extreme weather events, whether it's the drought that many of us are experiencing right now, or the longer term pressures of climate change itself. And we do know there's a lot of questions out there about what are the biological impacts or the ecological impacts of pesticides drifting and trespassing. And we do know from the literature that particularly with these growth regulator herbicides that you're going to learn about, 2,4-D and dicamba, they're both widely used in lawn care and in agriculture. Plants that are exposed to them they have a tendency to produce fewer flowers. Those flowers are visited less frequently by pollinators, and that some of those tissues can contain lower nutritional content. The Natural History Survey has been studying this, as well as some other researchers feeding caterpillars contaminated vegetation. And they're finding that the caterpillars that consume that vegetation have a lower biomass. And you can think there's certainly going to be ecological ramifications with those species like these birds that feed their young, those caterpillars. All of these things can lead to potential disruptions in plant and pollinator networks. And you can see how these exposures could possibly increase stress on these animals that are having to feed in these environments, and possibly find food in different areas, fly longer distances, or work harder for the same amount of calories and nutrition. And also through our monitoring and through the literature, we've realized that these exposures can also result in reduced fruit and nut production. And not even in the literature. I mean, the orchard peach trees that I just showed you, they've lost millions of dollars over the years in income because of smaller fruit, death in trees, et cetera. And that's a peach tree. We don't fully understand what that means for our wild trees and plants. And one last slide here before I turn it over to Marty. You know, we're talking about these cascading implications or potential cascading implications, and we don't fully understand them. But, you know, a couple of years ago, there was this story about, there's decline in these bat populations, which led to farmers turning to more pesticides because the bats were eating fewer of the insects that were flying around. And in those communities where they had increased pesticide use, they also linked that to increased deaths in infants. And so these are complex systems, and we don't fully understand how they're linked, but this was one example where they were able to tease this out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marty to talk about our monitoring data.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Kim, and especially the picture of the hat there. That was very cute. Okay, let me see what I can do here. So I need to share the screen. And let's go here. So Kim and I are in different locations here, so it may take us just a moment to make this transition. But let's go down here. Okay, here we go. Yep. So we need to go up here. Okay, let's try that. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some of the data primarily that Prairie Rivers Network has been collecting over the last 8 years in our tree and plant health monitoring project. And I'm basically going to be emphasizing a lot on the symptoms that we see, that share with you what they look like, a little bit on the geography of what we're observing in terms of herbicide drift, the frequency with which we're seeing herbicide drift, a quick list of the species that we've observed this on, and then some information that we're getting from our tissue samples about the chemicals that we're observing. So I like to introduce this by sort of thinking about this from the standpoint of what's happening in spring. That's not too far off. You know, in spring, we've got the birds returning. Already the robins are out fussing on my lawn over territories, and the doves are not nesting yet, but soon the herps will be out. That's coming up very soon. And, you know, it'll be very shortly. The spring wildflowers will be here. And our trees are going to be leafing out. This is a hickory bud, a shagbark hickory bud, and it's already swollen and getting ready to burst. And when it does, you know, we see a lot of potential in this young foliage that's occurring in our backyards, in our parks, in our nature preserves, in our forests, private forests, in other words. And when this development occurs, this is the kind of foliage that I think we kind of expect to see coming down the line. Nice, healthy green foliage that powers our whole ecosystems out here. But more and more in Illinois, this is the kind of foliage that we see developing in our hickories. Here's a young redbud leaf that's just emerging from the bud. And again, think about the potential that's there for the coming year. And our expectation is and ought to be that we're going to see foliage like this develop. This is a healthy, redbud leaf on a tree that's pretty healthy. But this is the kind of foliage that we see more and more and more of. In fact, almost universally in the state of Illinois, we're seeing injury to redbud that resembles this kind of foliage development. And then here's the young leaves of our state tree, the white oak. And the white oak is a beautiful tree, but its young leaves are very beautiful too, to be honest with you. And here is the development that we should expect normally: nice, young, nice, healthy, fully functioning foliage on white oak. But it's not uncommon to see oak trees, white oak, black oak, post oak, all 18, 19 species that we have native and developing in ways that look like this. So what does drift exposure look like? Well, I've just shared with you some of it, but I'm going to give you a quick 3-minute digital tour of the state of Illinois and share with you some of the images that we've recorded over the past 3 years, 2023, 2024, and 2025, from around the state, to just give you a flavor of the places and the species and the observations that we've been making in this program that Prairie Rivers Network has put together called the Tree and Plant Health Monitoring Project. And can you see this okay, Amy? Okay.
Yes. Yep. It's coming through great.
Okay, fine. Okay, I wasn't sure, but hopefully you can see the titles, the places where we've been observing, and the quality of the foliage that we're seeing, and including a list of the symptoms that are consistent with herbicide drift that you're observing on that particular slide as we go along here. These photos come from myself, and David Zaya from the Natural History Survey also contributed several of these photos, so I have to credit David. And I'm not sure if David actually took them or he picked them up from someone else at the History Survey, but he provided them for our presentation. My hope is, as we go through here, that you can see, if you have some familiarity with what our native, mostly trees in this case, leaves should look like, that most of what you're looking at is not normal. We'll note in a moment that Prairie Rivers' monitoring program has, while it's been active across the whole state, it's really been primarily collecting data south of Springfield, Champaign area. So our data up in the northern part of the state is a little bit less intense, less dense, you might say, but we certainly have data from that area as well. And we'll share some things that the History Survey did that will kind of fill in that gap that is there for the Prairie Rivers Network data. Okay, so there's a flavor of what we've been seeing, as Kim mentioned, and there's going to be a slight little bit of overlap here. We're not only seeing this in native tree species, but we're also seeing this in our cultivated specialty crop species like peach on the left. Not quite as dramatic as Kim's picture of her peach in Jackson County, but this is a herbicide injury on peach. On the right, you'll see herbicide injury on apple that we've observed, peach and apple, with the symptoms that are apparent there. And then we not only see these symptoms in woody plants, but we also see them in herbaceous plants. On the left, you see compass plant showing herbicide exposure symptoms. That's from Kane County, the one on the left. The one on the right is garden phlox from Washington County, down in my area, at a rural residence in Washington County, on a patio, compass plant, garden phlox. And we also see these symptoms in our gardens, in our plants. Again, back to Kane County on the left with the green bean. This is herbicide injury symptoms on green bean. And then back down in my neighborhood, these are tomatoes, Kim, from my garden in Nashville, Illinois. This was actually taken in 2024. This wasn't 2025. My injury this year looked a little different, but we definitely had it there. Okay, so a question, I'm going to try to pose a few questions here that might help us understand this topic. And the first is how common is, it should have been, how common is and how widespread are herbicide drift exposures in our state? And as Kim mentioned, in 2018, the Prairie Rivers Network took up this project called the Tree and Plant Health Monitoring Project. The project really has two key elements for identifying and documenting a herbicide drift. The first is monitoring. Okay, and let's see, my battery is running low, so let's try to see if we can solve that. It should not be a problem. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. That looks a little better. Disaster averted. So how is drift? How are we documenting drift exposure and identifying it and documenting it in this project from Prairie Rivers Network? The answer is, first of all, we are looking at symptoms on foliage. Actually, you can identify herbicide drift diagnostically, positively, from looking at the symptoms on foliage. And we're going to talk about those symptoms in just a minute. Secondly, you certainly can also identify herbicide drift by taking tissue samples, having those tissue samples analyzed at a reputable laboratory, and determining whether or not you can find residues of herbicides in that foliage. With regard to symptoms, the symptoms of herbicide exposure on plant life, especially trees, but plant life, have been documented for decades, and they are well documented in many, many different places. I've just got a couple examples up here for you to take a look at. The plant clinic at the University of Illinois Extension has a really good publication called Oak Problems, and in that publication, there's a whole section on herbicide injury, including many, many photographs that illustrate the different kinds of symptoms that you might expect with herbicide injury. Another really good, free, downloadable resource is Diseases of Trees in the Great Plains. It was published in 2016 by the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. It has an entire chapter, Chapter 6, on herbicide damage to trees and shrubs. It's really an excellent resource. And again, it's free as a download. When we're doing our monitoring, which we do, we've been doing since 2018, we do this using a standardized scientific protocol. And we have an example of the form that we use here over on the left. I just want to point out, we do things like obviously when we're at a site looking for these symptoms and documenting them, we take down information about the observer, date, and location. There's some information about a site ecology. And then we also, the real meat of this is looking at the species that we're observing, documenting the symptoms, and we also document the severity of those symptoms at each site as we go along. Now, there are 9 key symptoms that we look for when we're out monitoring for any particular species. And the list of them here is, we've got them circled here. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I do want to point out the 4 most common symptoms that we observe when we're looking at foliage. The first is curled and cupped leaves. The second is leaves that are sideways, upside down, or drooped. There's a technical term called epinasty in botany, which simply means that the petiole of the leaf has twisted the leaf sideways or upside down, or it has raised it up or drooped it. So these petioles are actually moving and turning the leaves in ways that are not natural or normal. Another major symptom is are irregular margins on the leaves, which can either be scalloped or pointed, and we'll show an example of that in just a minute. And then finally, is a very broad category we call twisted, deformed, or stunted. And And the number of different kinds of irregularities in form of leaves is astonishing and almost infinite. But we'll show you a few of those in just a second. Usually, there's more than one of these symptoms uh, demonstrated on any one particular plant. So what do these look like? Well, here's just a real quick review. Curled and cupped leaves. These are curled and cupped leaves on hickory. Typical um, herbicide exposure injury on hickory. With regard to like sideways, upside down, or drooped, this is a ginkgo demonstrating what virtually every kind of possible movement of a leaf that's possible. We have leaves that are drooped, we have leaves that are turned up, we have leaves that are turned sideways, and we have leaves that are turned upside down. So this is really a nice illustration of epinasty. You get 4 in 1 from this guy right here. So disoriented leaves. Irregular margins. Now this is wild grape. And this is a particular kind of irregular margin that we see on grapes, and we see these on oaks and a few other species in which the veins that go out to the end of the leaves actually project as points. So you have this sort of spiky appearance to the leaf. That's one type of irregular margin. There are several others. Another kind, illustrated by this flowering dogwood, are what we might call scalloped leaves. They sort of like the edge of a scallop shell. And you see this sort of, wavy, irregular margin along the edge. You often see this in flowering dogwood, very commonly. Another species that shows this just with great regularity is redbud. Redbud does this as well. And then finally, I have one slide that illustrates what we talk about in terms of either twisted, deformed, or stunted. And this is post oak. And again, this slide illustrates a lot of different things that can happen to a leaf when it's exposed to herbicides. We have clearly stunted leaves. We have leaves that have, you have to know a little bit, I understand, about what a post oak should look like, but hopefully you realize that since none of these leaves look like, one leaf looks like another, virtually none of them are actually normal. We have leaves that have bending and twisting of the central axis. We have leaves that have irregular lobing on the sides. We have leaves, especially in this case, where the proximal part of the leaf is almost normal and the apical portion of the leaf is greatly injured and deformed. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the proximal part of the leaf will be kind of diminished and the distal portion of the leaf will be greatly expanded. So you get all these different kinds of things. Okay, one other thing we do, just to mention very quickly, is that we not only document the symptoms that are there, but we also rate their severity. And so we have a scale of 0 to 10 that we use. It's very simple. 0 meaning the leaf is normal. It looks normal. And then, at the other extreme, we have 10. 10 is reserved for trees for which have leafed out and died, where the foliage has died, or it's on its way to dying. It's pretty clear. And then everything in between is sort of like a percentage of variation from normal. So like a 2 would be like a 20% variation or departure from normal. A 5 would be like a 50% departure from normal, and an 8 would be like an 80% departure from normal. The scale that we use is consistent with US EPA guidelines on how to rate foliage injury in plants. They have 2 different scales, 0 to 10 or 0 to 100 that they recommend, and we use the 0 to 10 scale. So another question is, where is drift being observed and how often has it been documented in our project? So here's a map of Illinois, and we're going to look at this just from a county standpoint for just a second. Prairie Rivers has now been doing this work for 8 years, from 2018 to 2025. Prairie Rivers has looked at 302 sites around the state, but only in 44 counties. I say only 44, that's quite a few. And 100% of and these are the 44 counties that we've been working in at Prairie Rivers over these years. 100% of the locations that we've looked at during those 8 years have had herbicide injury. We mentioned, of course, that they couldn't be here this evening, but the Natural History Survey did a very extensive, really brilliant study in 2023 where they looked at 185 sites in a single year in 95 counties. And to sort of summarize their data, more than 97% of the areas that they looked at demonstrated symptoms of herbicide injury. And I'm just going to fill in the counties. over and above the counties that we looked at over the 8 years where they worked. And these are the counties that they looked at. Again, virtually every site that they looked at had symptoms of herbicide drift injury. Now, hopefully I can see this because part of my screen is blocked out over here on the right, but in the 8 years that Prairie Rivers has been working, we've done 1,030 and counting, and they're not all in the database yet, 1,030 visits to those 302 sites. And we've documented herbicide injury at 1,028 of those visits. So that if it works out to 99.8% of the time in our case. Just a little bit more about the sites that we visit. We have a very large variety of sites, but the data just try to highlight the data that's in yellow here. 203 of those 302 sites have been rural, 99 have been urban. So basically 2/3 of the sites we look at have been rural and 1/3 have been urban over that time period. So there's a pretty nice split there. And within those environments, we look at a lot of different things. We look at everything from backyards to parks, to school grounds, to nature preserves, land and water reserves, private forests, private prairies, and so on and so forth. So it's a very diverse area. In total, we've also included in that 302 are 36 nature preserves, land and water reserves, and natural heritage landmarks that are covered by Illinois Nature Preserves Commission either programs.
Marty, I'm giving you your time warning that you asked for.
All right, thank you. All right, so let me continue on. So our exposure, so here's a question that we had. Are exposures occurring once or are they occurring multiple times during the growing season? This is a really important question. And to do that, you really need to look at multiple tissue samples within a single growing season to get answers to this question. So I'm going to give you data very quickly from one site where we have been studying a tree, one tree for the last 7 years, where we've been doing multiple tissue samples on a single tree for 7 straight years. It's the Harper property. It contains the state record post oak. It's in Washington County, which is fairly near where I live. And it's that tree right there on this property. This is about a 10-acre property. And just for some context, it's about 800 feet from where this tree occurs to the nearest cropland. Now, we don't just study this tree at this site. We look at this whole site and monitor the entire site. And over the last 8 years that we've been monitoring this, on average, we've documented herbicide drift on 18 different plant species per year at this site. I want to give you an idea of what's happening to post oak on this site, because that state record post oak is not the only post oak. There are about 30 post oaks on this site. And this shows the trend in ratings for those 30 post oaks over those 8 years. And you can see, and there's a variation, not all the trees score the same on that rating. You can look at, there's a low rating that ranges from about 1 to 3. There's a high rating that has ranged from 4 up to 8. And the average rating is running in between right there. So there's a range of symptom severity on these trees. Here's a picture of that state record post oak. Kim, this is from a little bit healthier time in its life cycle. It's a couple of years ago that this was taken. It's not quite as pretty now, but it's still a state record. During the last 7 years, we've taken 23 tissue samples from this one tree. And I want to show you the data. But before I do that, I'm going to show you what the foliage on this tree looked like for the last 9 years. That's what it looked like in 2017, 2018, 2019, which I guess 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and this year, 2025. And in case you don't know what a good post oak leaf is supposed to look like, that's what it's supposed to look like. So what we've seen is, a lot of injury on this tree over the years. In fact, just to put some context on that, I just showed you a graph of what the 30 post oaks look at. The trend has been for them over the past 8 years. The pink line that you see in the middle of this graph is the score specifically for that state record post oak over that time period. So I think you can see that it's not scoring the lowest, it's not scoring the highest in terms of symptom severity. It's been pretty average, maybe just a little bit above average. but pretty average in terms of its value. And I'm not going to talk about that particular item right now because we don't have time. But I'm going to show you the results of those 23 tissue samples. And on the right, and I cannot see this column because of some things that are right here from Zoom, but these are the tissue sample results from this tree over the past 7 years. We have the results for glyphosate. A yes means that we found the residue. A 0 means we tested and did not find the residue. And a blank means we didn't test for the residue in that particular time slot. Here's the results we got for glufosinate. It's one of the ones that Kim mentioned earlier, and she showed you a graph of the use over the past few years. Here's another corn herbicide that we test for with some regularity called metallochlor. Like atrazine, it's usually a pre-emergent plant. We've also tested for atrazine over time, and you can see what the rate of finding these herbicides is. When it comes to metallochlor and atrazine, we're finding them about half the time when we test. This is the data for dicamba. And again, we've tested for it more often. And again, we find it in this particular tree about half the time. And then this is the data for 2,4-D that we've got over that time period. And you can see that we're finding it with great regularity. On the left column here, we have all the dates that this tree has been sampled over that 7-year period, 4 times in 2019, 4 times in 2020, and then 3 times each in 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25. To illustrate where we're going with this in terms of trying to figure out how many times a tree or our areas are being exposed to herbicides throughout a growing season, I'm going to give you an example from 1 year. And that year is 2022, where we tested 3 times. So let's take a look and see what we found in 2022 when we tested 3 times. We tested foliage samples sent to a lab with results in mid-May, mid-June, and mid-July. So what did we find? And this is the foliage in 2022, and I was taking a sample at that time. So in mid-May, we found 2,4-D as a residue in this tree. In mid-June, we found from another sample glyphosate, glufosinate, and dicamba. Notice now that the 2,4-D is no longer detectable. And then in mid-July, we found glufosinate. But we found glufosinate at 3 times the level that it was found in mid-June. So what does that tell us? Well, our interpretation of this is that what we have here is evidence for at least 3 different exposures. There was an exposure in May, then a different set of exposures in June, and yet another exposure in July as well. So if we look so that's the logic that we use in terms of trying to determine whether or not we've got an additional or new exposure from succeeding tissue samples when they're taken. So we just said, and let's look at the 2022 data. That each sample gave us evidence of either a new or an added exposure to a pesticide, to a herbicide. And that's that data right there. So what about, we're not going to go through all these others one by one, but what about the others over those 7 years? What did we find? Well, that's what we found. In 21 of those 23 samples, we were able to determine that the sample gave us information that was new with regard to either we had additional exposure of a herbicide that we found previously or a brand new exposure that was not present before the previous sample. So what we're seeing is multiple exposures throughout a single growing season. So to summarize, we had 21 different exposure events in 7 years. And the other thing I want to say is that this is not the only tree where we have this kind of data, where we have multiple samples from a single source throughout one growing season. We have now samples from Northern Illinois, Central Illinois, and Southern Illinois. And although this data is more limited than our monitoring data, we're seeing the same pattern of multiple exposures throughout a single growing season. Well, okay, so what does that lead to? What do multiple exposures lead to? Well, the literature is full of information about the fact that this is not good for long-term tree health if you're talking about trees right now. So what can these chronic exposures annually, they're occurring every year and multiple times within a year, cause in terms of tree health? Well, here's a classic example of what it can occur. Uh, this tree demonstrates at least two of those long-term chronic health symptoms. One is epicarmic branching, which is proliferation of small twigs from the main branches of the tree. Simultaneously, you tend to see dieback of branch tips on these trees. So this is a post oak. This happens to be from the Harper area that we talked about, and that is the state record post oak right there. It has lost 6 of its neighbors to death over the last 8 years. And I can tell you that the tree, another of its neighbors, which is kind of a much younger neighbor, is not going to be with us too many years longer at the rate it's going right now. So this is the kind of thing that you can see. This is a picture of that state record post oak right now from underneath, looking up through the tree. And this illustrates yet another symptom that we see that we do not record because it's a little tricky to do, but it's called thinning canopy. And if you're familiar with what maybe a tree, an oak should look like, there's too much sky showing through this tree. This is later in the year. So this is thinning canopy, another symptom of chronic health decline in a tree. This is a more severe example of thinning canopy from a post oak that's a neighbor tree to the state record post oak. And frankly, this can occur when you have this long-term chronic exposures as well, tree death. Okay, very quickly, how many species have been documented with herbicide exposure in the Prairie Rivers Network program over this era? Well, today we've identified herbicide exposure symptoms on 314 species from 73 different plant families. 256 of those are native species. The history survey in their 1 year, of course, they covered the whole, more counties than we did. They identified herbicide exposure symptoms on over 400 species in that 1 year. One other way to summarize this data is to think about these symptoms in terms of plant type. We've identified symptoms on 109 different tree species, 18 of which are oaks, 59 shrub and woody vine species, 56, I'm sorry, and 149 herbaceous plant species, including this picture on the right that Kim sent me of she says it's a cup plant from her, I think it was from her yard or her prairie planting. And I have to take her word for it that it's a cup plant because it's so badly damaged that. So Kim, do you have any second thoughts about that?
Oh, Kim, you're muted still.
Okay.
And Marty, I'm going to give you your second time warning while we're waiting for Kim. So
yeah, we're at 7:14, so we better carry on. But yeah, no, I don't think I said that was a cup plant. I think that was a wing stem from our prairie planting.
Okay. All
right. But it doesn't matter. Either way, it has injury.
Okay. So I'm going to skip this slide. I'm just going to go very quickly and mention when we do tissue samples, which we do often from our trees, we send them off to a lab, a certified lab. We have a very strict protocol that we follow. These are the trees and plants that we have tissue sampled over the past 8 years. And you can see, I just wanted to point out that we've sampled a lot of oaks, redbud, sycamore, and several other species as well. These are the frequencies that we've done that with. And just to give you a quick rundown on what our tissue sample findings have been, in total we've sampled 22 different species. We've submitted a total of 212 samples for analysis. 200 of those, 212 samples have come back positive for at least one herbicide residue. That's 94% of the samples. And those 200 positive samples have isolated and identified 459 separate residues, herbicide residues from 17 different herbicides over that time period. And this is just a listing by herbicide of 11 of those 17 herbicides, both the testing frequency and the frequency with which we have found those. And Kim, I don't know, I think probably we may be out of time to talk about that at this point. Okay, all right, so we won't go into this, but you can take a quick glance at this and see both the testing frequency and then the frequency with which we found various of these herbicides. And all 5 of the ones that Kim mentioned earlier in her slide are in this slide as well, which glyphosate, glufosinate, 2,4-D, dicamba, and atrazine were ones that she had mentioned. Okay, that's what I had for now. And if we have more questions, we can certainly answer those. So back over to you, Kim, if I can get done with
Okay.
get done sharing here, I think. Boy, and where is that? Oh gosh, stop share. Okay, there we go.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
Thanks, Marty.
Okay. There, now you can see my stuff?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly about what the Natural History Survey found. As Marty touched on, 185 total sites. They were random sites, as well as 102 were Illinois Nature Preserves Commission sites. They visited early in the season, May 17th through July 6th, as well as late in the season, the 17th through September 9th. They took leaf tissue samples like we do, collecting bags of leaves and with clean equipment, putting them in a cooler or a freezer. They also did soil samples. And they didn't take from the edge of a farm field, often like we do, like neither of us, we all walk from the edge into a plot, and while we're monitoring and decide where we're going to take a sample of a symptomatic tree. Prairie Rivers often takes samples from symptomatic trees because the samples are extremely expensive. The Natural History Survey not only looked at symptomatic leaves and plants, but also took samples and monitored plants that were not symptomatic. They had theirs analyzed for 486 different pesticides. The majority of them were insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And here's just a photo that David shared that, they meandered through, they did time meanders where they stopped, monitored, and collected tissue samples. Their monitoring form was very similar to the one that we use. And here's what they found. On the first visit to these sites, the number one herbicide that they detected was atrazine at 77% of their sites, and a metabolite of atrazine. And then they also found 52% of their samples had 2,4-D present. In the second visit to their sites, it was a different story. They found more fungicides than they did in the herbicides. And this is something that we've recently started doing in our work also, is looking at more fungicides, particularly later in the season, because of what the Natural History Survey has found. And Marty touched on this, 97% of their sites, they detected pesticides as well as saw symptoms, primarily herbicides and fungicides. And also very similar to what we're finding, they're finding symptoms in oaks, shingle oak, blackjack oak, red bud, post oak, black oak, box elder, all very similar symptoms. These species are very similar list of species that are showing symptoms on a regular basis at their sites. In summary, they found symptoms with the most injury tended to be wetlands and grasslands, especially their cemeteries. Forests for them had less damage. These sites tended to be surrounded by agriculture, particularly soybean agriculture. And the smaller or narrower the site, the more injury that they tended to have. And that certainly would make sense. And many of our high quality natural areas in the state tend to be in areas of dense agriculture. So I'm going to step away a little bit from what the survey talked about and talk about what we're doing as an organization and what our partners are doing, like Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves and Illinois Environmental Council, et cetera, to work on, what can we do to stop the drift? And it is not, there's no silver bullet. There's not an easy solution to this. There are many things that need to happen at one time. And I could have a talk about any one of these things, and I'm going to touch on it at a very high level here, but we really need an updated regulatory structure. We need to strengthen the current laws that we have. We need additional regulations that adequately protect children, specialty crops, and high quality ecosystems from drift. And that can come in many different forms. Alongside of that, we need to work with the agricultural industry to shift them from this, industrialized system to using more integrated pest management, move beyond this deeply incentivized corn and soybean rotations, and support the production of other crops and support the markets for those other crops as well. We talked earlier about resiliency, and part of getting off of that herbicide treadmill is building resiliency in these cropping systems and breaking those pest and weed cycles naturally through increasing crop diversity and utilizing integrated pest management practices. We also need to educate our public. We're giving this talk tonight. We also give tours of sites that have injury. We work with city planners. We work with local government, state government, to take on tours of sites, talk about the symptoms so they understand them. Excuse me. And we also not only educating the general public, but our agencies on the severity of the issue of drift in the state. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice now. We also need comprehensive monitoring across the state. We can't solve this problem if we aren't documenting it. And in order to do that, we need a budget across the state that can adequately fund the research and the monitoring programs. Goodness, sorry. And Amy, I'm going to let you talk about this because I'm going to lose my voice, but this is our piece of pesticide legislation that we have out this year that our conservation partners are putting together.
Okay, well, I will impromptu take over because I know a little bit about this bill because Kim and I have talked a lot about it. So there is a bill that is being worked on. This is not, as Kim mentioned, is not a silver bullet. It's not the ultimate solution, but it is part of it. And this is House Bill 1596. And this bill would require that any large-scale application, and large-scale application would be defined as 5 acres, 5 contiguous acres or more, that the applicator would need to provide notice to administrators of schools and parks within a quarter of a mile from that school or park. And that would be a part of allowing camp counselors and school principals to make decisions about when to play outside and what to do with the children. And so it's a first step, but it is a piece. Now that we know that we know how much these herbicides and these chemicals are moving, I think we have an obligation to provide that information for protection. And so that is a piece that it's being introduced in Springfield this year, or this spring. So, Kim, I don't know if you have your voice. If your voice is back or not, or what you had next on your slides, but
that was actually my last slide, and thank you. I have been talking for 2 days straight, so I'm surprised it made it this long, but thanks for covering that slide, Amy.
No problem. That's the one slide I know the most about. So, okay. So there were a few questions in chat, and feel free, folks can drop more questions in the chat, but I'm going to try to scroll back up and stop. But Jamie asked if you know how far herbicide is drifting, over what distance it travels from where it was applied, and is that different when it comes to spray, or drift, spray or vapor? And so maybe Marty, Kim's resting her voice. Do you have information on how far are we seeing it drift?
Let me see if I can try to answer that with a slide. And I'm not I'm not doing so well. So go to the next. I'm going to see if I can answer that with a slide. If you want to take up the next question, if I
Okay.
can get it up here. I do have a slide that kind of
Yeah.
goes to that.
And
So
then there was a question, how much do lawn care chemicals contribute to the problem? And somebody dropped a link in the chat that says homeowners used up to 10 times more chemical pesticides per acre in the urban environment than farmers' usage on crops. We should also keep in mind what the difference in acreage is there too. But Kim, maybe you could share what we're seeing. How much do lawn care chemicals contribute to the problem?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely contribute to the problem. And, many times I see people that are injuring their own trees in their own lawn. They have these perfectly lush green lawns, and their red buds and their oaks look very, very ill. So, but they're not only, these chemicals can drift just like from ag fields, they can drift from yards as well and cause injury in your neighbor's yards as well. So,
I would just add, Amy, that two-thirds of our observations are in the rural environment, outside of cities and suburban areas, places where lawns are treated. And we see injury levels in our rural areas that are at least as serious as we see in our urban environment. So that tells us a lot when we look at the level of symptoms that we observe in these two environments, that the levels of injury to plants in our rural environments, and that includes our nature preserves and private forests and so forth, is at least as great as it is in the urban environment. So that is just a fact that we've been able to determine over time. So but Kim is correct. The additional applications that are occurring in urban environments are certainly a concern as well, without a doubt. I do have a slide maybe that I could share with regard to this
Yeah,
drift.
the distance. Hmm.
Yes, distance. And if I can do that here. Uh, uh, Up between 2018 and
Oh,
2000,
Marty, there we go. Okay.
between 2018 and 2023, uh, but we still do this, but I just haven't updated the data. We actually measure the distance from where we are monitoring to the closest potential source of drift. Now, it's not necessarily an actual source of drift, but the closest potential source of drift. And we can go into the details of that, but I want to show you the distances that we are observing drift at in our monitoring program just through 2023. This was for 545 different monitoring events out of about 690 that were done during that time period. We were able to do these distance measures on about 545 of those, so that you can see the bottom is them organized by day of the month, day of the year, and on the left you see the number of feet that we observed drift at. And the really important thing about this particular graph is that you can see these distances are very substantial. Look at the number that go beyond, say, 600 feet here and so forth. But what's really important about these graphs is not one of those endpoints on that graph actually represents an end to drift. It represents an end to as far as we could monitor drift under the circumstances of that particular visit. We never actually saw a place where drift stopped. We were walking further and further and further from a potential source, and we saw, oh, there's a cessation of symptoms. What we stopped us was a property line. We ran out of time. We ran into a river or creek we couldn't cross, or to go further started getting you closer to another potential source of drift. So you couldn't possibly get any further from a potential source of drift. So I hope that at least gives an illustration and maybe a partial answer to the question about how far is this material moving. If there's a further question on that, I'd be glad to answer it, but I'll stop the share at this point and we can go back to something else. But could you see that? Okay, Amy? Amy?
Yeah, yeah, that was
All right,
that
okay,
was helpful. Yeah.
okay.
There was also a question in the chat and a little bit of discussion about the Illinois Department of Ag and the IDNR, and I might expand that to even to the Illinois EPA, and what are our state agencies doing about this? And And I don't know if I have a little information, but Kim or Marty, maybe you want to share a little bit more if like what you.
Marty, I'm going to let you take that, get your opinion on it.
Well, thank you. Well, my opinion hasn't probably changed very much over the last couple of years, and that is my opinion is not enough. We are seeing the same levels of injury that we saw back in 2000, starting in 2018 and 2019 and 2020, pretty much unabated, in the last 3 or 4 years. So we've been looking at this problem for 8 years, and we have been watching uh, herbicide drift exposure at great distances in significant levels of foliar injury in virtually every place we look at. Now, please believe, there's a variation in the intensity. Some places have fairly low intensity levels of drift. Others have very high, and there's a great range in the middle in there. But in terms of uh, change that's positive, if you could see a positive trend, uh, we just haven't been able to detect it over that time. So, is that disappointing? I can tell you it's disappointing to a lot of people who are suffering this injury year after year after year. And I mean a lot of people, almost everyone I talk to
Yeah.
who has this injury year after year after year. And they're watching, their gardens suffer. They're watching their plants suffer in their yard. They're seeing health declines in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases in the plants in their landscape or in their forest or in their nature preserve. Uh,
It is,
and they are not happy about it. Understand, I think totally understandably. So I'd say not
it,
enough.
it is very hard to um, get any type of meaningful legislation or improvements in pesticide regulation in Illinois. The Illinois EPA pretty much differs to IDOA, which is the agency charged with enforcing the Illinois Pesticide Act in Illinois. So they, defer to IDOA, and IDOA is, the ag industry in Illinois is incredibly influential and powerful. And so it is a constant effort of patience and negotiation and sharing data and having conversations. DNR is concerned about this issue, particularly also the Nature Preserves Commission is extremely concerned about the condition and the degradation of the nature preserves around the state. So we are trying to work at bits and pieces from all of these angles that I talked about and others that I didn't mention, through work with our partners like Amy and IUC and other groups that care deeply. And, Audubon is very concerned and active in this issue as well. So hard to move the agencies along, though.
Yeah, Kim, I would, yeah, maybe share too that it was the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission and IDNR that funded also the work that the Illinois Natural History Survey did. So there is
Yeah.
that report is public. But since that time, there hasn't been any movement with the other state agencies sort of in response to that, I guess. So,
Yeah.
and I
I
think,
I would say,
go
this
ahead.
is harming DNR lands. This is harming the lands that DNR owns and manages. So they are very concerned about it.
Kim, you said that it's difficult to do this in Illinois. Is Illinois behind other states in the Midwest on this?
I mean, interestingly enough, we are certainly ahead of other states in terms of the information that we've gathered. The work that the Natural History Survey's done, the work that the agencies have, like DNR staff have done in monitoring their sites in collaboration with us and in our monitoring, we have more data than any other state that we know of. Missouri is grappling with this. Nebraska is grappling with this. Iowa, Indiana, Arkansas. the Carolinas. It is not unique to Illinois, but I don't think anyone is ahead of us. We're all trying to struggle, especially in the current federal climate that we're in, with Illinois EPA and changes that are coming constantly. It is an uphill battle right now, especially at the federal level.
There was a question in the chat also about how we reconcile the toxic drift of herbicide and the importance of its use in restoring efforts when working and educating the public. So how do we balance that?
I think it's stewardship of the use of herbicides and making sure that you are using them appropriately and sparingly, but also effectively to manage those invasive species. We're not, I think by and large, the conservation community tries to be incredibly responsible with their use of pesticides. That's not saying I'm sure there's cases where, there are bad examples of pesticide use, but in most cases, they're caring for these areas and they want to protect these areas as well as they possibly can. So they're using them judiciously. And Amy, I mean, you worked on a pesticide applicator license that was specifically geared toward managing conservation lands. So you can probably also address that question.
I mean, it's hard to reconcile too, but I also think in most cases, the quantities and the way that they're being used in restoration is frequently different than the ways that they are being, and the quantities and the methods of application are different. But
Yeah.
it is a discussion that I think we all need to be reconciling with and having conversation about.
Yeah, I mean, and drift can still happen, and it certainly does from restoration efforts. But
And I think you talked a little bit about how we can discourage the use of chemicals in lawn care when you were answering the question about is that also a problem? I don't know if either of you, I just tell people you need to embrace what people think of as a weedy lawn, but it is hard. But I don't know if you have any other advice.
I think the more people can see diverse, beautiful lawns, the more it will become culturally acceptable. There's a gradient of what people can live with. Some people have to have that edged, manicured lawn, but you can walk people, I think, towards a more wild and natural lawn. And I think it's, in my opinion, I'm not an expert on that, but I feel like the more people that see the beauty of native lawns, the more widely accepted that they will become. And I know that there's a lot of ordinances and efforts around the state trying to get, homeowners associations allowing, wild lawns, native lawns within their homeowners association. So I think efforts like that also are really important and effective.
Just to add to that, Amy,
Yeah.
one of the things that I think most homeowners who are treating their lawns are not aware of is the fact that there are these risks associated with those applications. And I think a part of the movement forward in trying to deal with that issue is simply making people aware of the risks that are associated with this. The vast majority have no idea that they may be damaging their own plant life, their neighbor's plant life, and potentially the health of their own family and of neighboring families with some of these chemical applications. So those are very important risks that people are not aware of in many cases that would be useful in terms of throwing into the debate and in the scales, right, of deciding what your tolerance is for having a little bit of clover or chickweed in your lawn.
Yeah. And there's a question, are there some in the farming communities and industry that are willing to sit down and talk about this with Prairie Rivers Network? Oh, Kim, you're muted, or I can't hear you.
Yeah, there are more of them. I mean, more of them are already on the way towards going, to being less reliant on chemicals when they're at that place of wanting to talk about, how we can make things better, or they're already eliminating chemical usage because of, you know, their own families and health reasons or just environmental reasons. There is a big, I think, cultural hurdle within the conventional agricultural system that makes those conversations difficult and challenging. I welcome them. They're not easy conversations. I'll be having them next week up in Chicago with a bunch of folks. So they need to happen, but our tables don't always talk to each other. We don't always have each other at the same table. So we need to do better about that.
All right. How do we know if our homegrown veggies are safe to eat? Marty, you showed us pictures of damaged tomato plants. I mean, how
Well,
do you know if any of it is safe, homegrown or wherever it's grown?
just keep expanding your question.
Uh-huh.
Um, when you see herbicide drift damage on your tomatoes, on your lettuce, on your cucurbits, broccoli, cauliflower, green beans, uh, cucumbers, uh, like as I do in my own garden, you have to ask that question. And if I could test my veggies for less than $200 to $400 per sample, I'd be doing it, and a lot of other people would be too. So I think the answer is you don't.
There was one more question, but I think I can answer this one. Pest control companies are regulated by IDPH and IDOA. Shouldn't lawn care companies that apply products also be regulated? And the answer is they are. They are also regulated by the Illinois Department of Agriculture. Did I get that one right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Um, all right. Are there any more questions? If anybody want to come off mute or put another question in chat? Oh, here we go. Is there a parallel issue with neonics, which are devastating insect populations? It's a quick one. It's just
Yeah,
yes or no.
yeah, yes, there is. There most definitely is. And a lot of that is coming from the treated seed market and our use of treated seeds, because they are exempt essentially through the Treated Article Exemption Act and DFRA. So neonics are a tough one. We would need to probably ban the use of treated seeds in the state. And that would take, again, a cultural shift within the agricultural community, because it is hard to find untreated seeds in the state of Illinois and throughout much of the Midwest.
So in some ways, is very much a parallel issue because this is not about one piece of legislation or one piece of a
Right.
solution, but this is about cultural shifts in
Yep.
thinking about how we use chemicals.
Very much so.
All right. Are there any other questions? All right. I get to this point in the meeting and I always feel like it's very disappointing because we can't give you a round of applause, but there will be clapping hands. I'm going to stop the recording.